Imagine a world where the sun never set on the British Empire. In 1940, London was the financial capital of the globe, and the British Royal Navy was the undisputed master of the seas. But behind the closed doors of 10 Downing Street, Winston Churchill was facing a nightmare that no one else could see. The empire was bleeding gold. The cost of standing alone against Nazi Germany was not just measured in lives, but in every single... A world where the sun never set on the British Empire. In 1940, London was the financial capital of the globe, and the British Royal Navy was the undisputed master of the seas. But behind the closed doors of 10 Downing Street, Winston Churchill was facing a nightmare that no one else could see. The empire was bleeding gold. The cost of standing alone against Nazi Germany was not just measured in lives, but in every single ounce of treasure the British had accumulated over 3 centuries of global dominance. Britain had spent hundreds of millions of pounds in just the first few months of the war. They were buying everything from the United States: aircraft, machine guns, oil, and grain. But the Americans, still haunted by the unpaid debts of World War I, had passed a law called cash and carry. If Britain wanted help, they had to pay up front in cash and carry the goods away in their own ships. Churchill knew that by the end of the year, the vaults of the Bank of England would be empty. The British lion was roaring, but it was starving to death. This was the moment the keys to the world began to slip from London's fingers. In the summer of 1940, as the Luftwaffe began dropping bombs on London, the British government launched one of the most daring and secret financial operations in human history, Operation Fish. The mission was simple but terrifying. Move the entire gold reserve of the United Kingdom across the Atlantic Ocean to Canada. They couldn't risk the gold falling into Hitler's hands if an invasion occurred. Thousands of gold bars and billions in negotiable securities were packed into unmarked wooden crates and loaded onto fast merchant ships. These ships sailed through the U-boat alley of the Atlantic, where German submarines were sinking anything that moved. Every sailor on those ships knew that they were carrying the literal future of their empire. But the gold wasn't just going to Canada for safety. As soon as it arrived, much of it was immediately sent to the Federal Reserve in New York. It was the down payment for survival. By the time 1941 arrived, the British Treasury was functionally bankrupt. They had traded their centuries of accumulated wealth for the hope of surviving one more month. By late 1940, Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking supply ships faster than Britain could build them. Churchill begged President Franklin D. Roosevelt for help. He needed destroyers, ships that could hunt submarines. Roosevelt had 50 aging World War I-era destroyers sitting in mothballs. He was willing to give them to Britain, but not for money, because Britain had no money left. Instead, Roosevelt demanded a price that changed the map of the world forever. In exchange for 50 old ships, Britain gave the United States 99-year rent-free leases on military bases across the Western Hemisphere. From the shores of Newfoundland to the tropical islands of Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, and St. Lucia, the British flag was lowered and the American flag was raised. Roosevelt had achieved what no foreign enemy had ever done. He had dismantled the British military perimeter in the Atlantic without firing a single shot. The United States was no longer just a neighbor, it was becoming the landlord of the British Empire. In March 1941, the United States passed the Lend-Lease Act. Roosevelt famously told the American public that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him your garden hose. You don't ask for the cost of the hose up front. You just want it back when the fire is out. It sounded like the ultimate act of friendship, But the fine print of the Lend-Lease Agreement was a poisoned chalice for the British Empire. The U.S. provided $31 billion in aid to Britain, but it came with conditions that would change the global economy. America demanded that Britain abandon its imperial preference, the trade system that allowed the empire to trade exclusively within its colonies. The U.S. wanted access to the markets of India, Africa, and Australia. They were ensuring that once the war was over, American corporations would be the ones selling to the world, not British ones. Every crate of Spam and every Sherman tank that arrived in London was another nail in the coffin of British economic independence. As the war dragged on, the Americans grew even more demanding. They wanted proof that Britain was truly broke before they sent more aid. The U.S. Treasury demanded that Britain sell off its private overseas investments. This was the liquidation. British citizens who owned shares in American companies like Viscose or American Railways were forced to sell them to the government, which then sold them to American investors at fire sale prices. But it didn't stop there. British-built railways in Argentina, oil refineries in the Middle East, and tea plantations in Asia were sold off to satisfy the American demand for reciprocal aid. The infrastructure of the empire was being cannibalized. By 1944, Britain had lost nearly 25% of its total national wealth. While the factories in the Midwest were booming and creating a new middle class, the factories in northern England were either rubble or struggling to survive on American credit. The transition of power was no longer a theory, it was a line item on a ledger. In 1944, as the Allied armies were pushing toward Germany, another battle was being fought in a hotel in New Hampshire. The Bretton Woods Conference gathered the world's financial minds to decide how money would work after the war. The British were led by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes. He wanted a neutral global currency to keep things fair. But the Americans, led by Harry Dexter White, had all the leverage. They had the gold, they had the ships, and they had the debt. The result was the coronation of the U.S. dollar. The dollar would be the world's reserve currency, backed by gold, and every other currency would be tied to it. The British pound, which had ruled global trade for over a century, was demoted to a secondary player. Britain was forced to agree because they needed American billions just to keep their people from starving after the war. At Bretton Woods, the British Empire didn't just lose its money, it lost its status as the manager of the world's economy. When the guns finally went silent in 1945, Britain expected a moment of relief. Instead, they received a shock. Days after Japan surrendered, President Harry Truman abruptly canceled Lend-Lease. The garden hose was taken back while the house was still smoldering. Britain was left with a massive dollar gap. They needed to buy food and fuel, but had no dollars to pay for them. To avoid a total collapse, the British government had to beg for a new loan. In 1946, they signed the Washington Loan Agreement for $3.75 billion. But the price was devastating. America forced Britain to make the pound convertible, meaning anyone holding pounds could instantly trade them for dollars. This caused a massive run on the British banks as everyone wanted the more stable American currency. The loan didn't help Britain rebuild. It ensured that Britain remained dependent on American financial policy for the next 60 years. The victory of 1945 felt very much like a surrender in London's financial district. For decades, while the world moved into the space age and the digital age, the ghost of World War II continued to haunt the British budget. Generation after generation of British taxpayers were paying for the bombs that fell in 1940 and the tanks that crossed the Rhine in 1945. The debt was so massive that it survived the fall of the Berlin Wall and the creation of the Internet. Finally, on December 29, 2006, 61 years after the end of the conflict, the United Kingdom made its final payment of $83 million to the United States. Only then was the secret bill finally settled. The British Empire was long gone, replaced by a modern island nation, while the United States stood as the world's only superpower. The war wasn't just won on the battlefield, it was won in the banks. I am Aljanib, and this is GriotVibe. Remember, in the game of empires, the one who holds the debt holds the crown.